Coming up, it's the critical year for the 2022 draft class, and Joe Schoen knows it can be make or break. Not only saddled with the bad Dave Gettleman era, but thinking about who deserves a future contract and how they will directly influence the success at key positions. We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Armbrecht, over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise. We're talking about, Andrew, the critical year ahead and how it does become a little bit make or break nature. As we know, perceptually, year 3 for a draft class is when we cement our thoughts about them and also reflect back on how people graded them out initially a few years ago.
Yeah, you think about draft class, you get all the draft grades, the instant reactions, which we'll go through in Joe Schoen's inaugural drafting year for the Giants. But to your point, Adam, that means nothing until you see the actual play on the field. How do they perform? Are they developing? Are they progressing? Has the injury bug got them? There's a whole host of ways things can go. And so, when you look a few years later, year 3 is always the most important, to your point, Adam, because one, you have 2 years, one rookie year and one as being in there, getting developed. So you have 2 years of game film already. Year 3 is really the one where it's like, okay, put up or shut up time. And really, it's also because of the way contracts are structured in the NFL. If you're a first round pick, by the end of year 3 going into year 4, you have to decide on whether or not you pick up that 5th-year option, which is an important distinction of why, first round draft picks are sometimes drafted where they are. But also, Adam, if you're not a first round draft pick and you've gone through 3 years, traditionally, you sign 4-year contracts when you get drafted in the NFL. And so having only 1 year left on your deal, if you want to stay with the organization and the organization wants you, that's really where the rubber meets the road and you make decisions on whether or not people are going to be getting a second contract, which is why we're kind of highlighting the 2022 draft class upcoming for this season.
Yeah, you better believe it, man. Ryan Dunleavy did a good job saying that the spotlighting, hey, this is going to be a very interesting year to watch. We've also talked about over the course of this offseason already, thinking about certain key players that would be obviously coming out of that 2022 draft class for the Giants, whether it's a Wan'Dale Robinson now inside of what feels like a more complete core with an elite number 1 on paper in Malik there. You have guys like Cor'Dale Flott now getting big opportunities, maybe to step into a new role on the outside in this secondary, right? So you go down that list there, and we will in a little more detail in just a second. But we've mentioned all these names over the course of the offseason. Like, there's a reason why when you look towards training camp, you think, hey, I can circle dozens of names on this roster, and probably 5, 6, or even 7 of them are going to be players that we think about having kind of make or break seasons. But the one little caveat I want to give to this, because it's not only critical for these players, it's not only critical for Joe Schoen, who we're talking about, hey, this is where we start to judge your draft classes. It's also critical because organizationally, and this falls under Joe Schoen, coming out of the Dave Gettleman era, there's a reason why this has been a struggle. There's a reason why after kind of a flashy second year going to the playoffs and having that success, why it starts to then maybe become frustrating, missing the playoffs a year ago and now thinking, what is this team going to be? Because 2021, which would have been going into that critical year 3 this past season for a draft class, Andy, that consists of Kadarius Toney, not on the roster, Azeez Ojulari, often injured but high-value draft pick, Aaron Robinson, injured, can't stay healthy, Ellerson Smith not here, Gary Brightwell cut, Rodarius Williams cut last season. That's the incoming class. When you're Joe Schoen walking in the door and looking at that, you start to understand why it's not just about bringing in talent and building this team going forward. It's about reconstructing the core, something we realize but is crystallized when you look back and see, ain't nobody here when we talk about the New York Football Giants, and you have to go back another year prior to at least circle Andrew Thomas.
After three seasons, none of those players are impact players for the Giants.
Nobody.
Yeah. Half of them are gone, right? As you mentioned, Kadarius Toney, Rodarius Williams, Ellerson Smith, gone. Aaron Robinson hasn't been on the field. Azeez Ojulari has been on the field very sparingly. Adam, when you miss, that's 6 draft picks. When you whiff on 6 draft picks, essentially, and they're all under cost-controlled rookie contracts, you have to find a way to figure out how to replace that by going out on the free agent market or going to the waiver wire or overpaying someone or giving up additional draft capital to rectify the mistake. It's why Dave Gettleman is no longer here. It's why Joe Judge is no longer here. It's because when you waste all of that draft capital, it is impossible to create the depth that the Giants are looking for. It's one of the challenges the Giants have. When someone goes down with an injury over the last year or two, it felt like it was a wasteland, a barren wasteland behind that person. There is no depth on this Giants roster, and it's taking 2 or 3, maybe even 4 draft classes to overturn some of these mistakes from the previous regime.
No, 100%. That's the problem. It's like not only did you lose the value of where you picked and having a key contributor, first and second rounds especially, you hope that a third rounder can find a role for you, even if it's from a depth perspective. Then you hope that you can sign some of those guys to reasonable second contracts, not because they're going to be stars for you, but because, okay, that's our baseline. Then we draft again first and second rounders. We hope that they take over, and you start to have this nice little supplemental talent on your roster instead of feeling like you're devoid. And go ahead.
Two quick things. One, you're like, well, that's not fair, Adam, because Kadarius Toney was traded for a draft pick that was then used. And who was it used on? It was used on Darren Waller, who was around for half a season and decided to retire. And now we have some dead money on the cap. It almost would have been worse just to tell Kadarius Toney to go away and not show up on the field, so you don't have all that dead money on there, which is the first thing. The second, to your point about the different levels and the cascading effect of these draft classes, it is important, and it is the key of every single general manager in the NFL. You have to have a cascading effect when you have to re-sign players to a second contract. You can't have all of your great players be up at the exact same time, or else you run into crazy issues. Look at the Dallas Cowboys right now. Dak Prescott has ultimate leverage over the team. CeeDee Lamb is holding out. He wants a deal. Micah Parsons wants a deal. They have to pay their 3 best players all at the exact same time, and they're all going to be record-breaking contracts essentially when they get off the books. You need to hit every other, you need these players to be dependable every draft class so that you can push dead money, you can restructure contracts, and have flexibility to operate in today's NFL.
And that's why coming up here in a second, let's look at that draft class entering a critical year 3, 11 picks in that draft class, and why it's so important for more of them to hit than not, but also where did the NFL stand coming out of that draft? How do they feel about what Joe Schoen did in his first year at the helm? We'll dive into it all coming up here in just one moment. Before we continue, or as we continue, our OGP episode today, remind you, today's episode is brought to you by Potential, Pietential. Potential is an online wellness assessment tool. It's free for individual users. It sets the benchmark for your well-being, gives you tools to improve over time, and allows you to track your progress. Incidentally, might have been something. I'm almost positive Joe Schoen got set up on Potential when he took over the GM job. And if he's tracking his progress, he probably needs some of those helpful tools to make sure that he keeps an even keel as he goes into a critical season for himself and also the New York Football Giants. Check out Potential today. Andy, I mentioned it there, 11 players. Like, this is also awareness from the New York Football Giants coming out of the Dave Gettleman era. They're like, hey, you know what would be great? If we can throw a lot of young bodies into this room here to try to rebuild our core. Now, Kayvon Thibodeau, obviously right there, and Evan Neal, and couldn't be two more contrasting kind of player models here. Wan'Dale Robinson, Joshua Ezeudu, Cor'Dale Flott, Daniel Bellinger, Dane Belton, Micah McFadden, DJ Davidson, Marcus McKathan, and Darian Beavers. We can hit these at a few different levels here, but obviously, as I say, nothing more crystallizing than looking right there at the top with Kayvon Thibodeau and Evan Neal, pick 5, pick 7. Obviously, the Giants and Joe Schoen said, hey, let's make cornerstone pieces. And frankly, that's how the NFL perceived it at the time when they took those 2 players.
Yeah, I mean, we were extremely excited for the Giants draft, especially what they did in the first round. You mentioned Kayvon Thibodeau. He was the guy that we wanted. I wouldn't have been upset with Sauce Gardner, but he obviously went to the Jets earlier than the Giants pick. But Kayvon Thibodeau was a game-changing, charismatic edge rusher that we definitely wanted to be able to have. Yeah. And all media pundits and everyone else said Evan Neal was the right pick. And we agreed. I liked him more than Charles Cross. I liked him more than Ike Ekwonu. I think, Adam, you and I both thought that Evan Neal was going to flourish. And we weren't the only ones. And let me just explain. Mel Kiper, one of the best draft pundits out there for ESPN, his round 1 winner was the New York Giants. Dan Kelly of The Ringer gave the Evan Neal draft pick an A+. Other members of the Athletic gave it an A. Chad Reuter of NFL.com gave it an A. Even Art Stapleton, someone we love from NorthJersey.com, gave the Thibodeau pick an A and the Evan Neal pick an A as well. It felt like the momentum coming out of that draft was the Giants didn't miss. There's no way that either of these prospects can miss, knowing the potential that they have and also the production that they've had in college as well.
Oh, believe me. Yes. It was the idea is, hey, the Giants have done it. Joe Schoen has done it. He set the new cornerstones for this team. And you already had the holdover in Andrew Thomas, obviously, and he was established as, hey, we feel amazing about having him on the left side. Now we're going to have Evan Neal. There's our bookend. So 100%. And the interesting thing about it, too, is because I remember going through that draft class, Wan'Dale Robinson, it was oh, that's interesting because the Giants targeted him, wanted him. And there was some questions about, was that too rich to go make a play like that for Wan'Dale Robinson? When you think about guys like then Joshua Zudo, it was the same thing. I remember, now in totality, we can talk about it, but as you have the draft board up in front of you, if you're watching over on YouTube, I remember a lot of it being Giants liked Zudo. That's what you heard. They wanted to go and get their guy. Cor'Dale Flott, same kind of thing, right? A lot of it was about the Giants identified the players that they liked in this draft and took them after the first round picks there, after obviously the top 7, where it feels like, hey, the board's going to tell you a lot. They identified their talent and brought in those guys. And what I find interesting and maybe encouraging is that we now enter a year, Andy, where Cor'Dale Flott is getting this new opportunity. Joshua Zudo is getting a new opportunity, maybe to be a key swing tackle piece. Maybe he'll find his way into the starting rotation. Guys like Dane Belton, no more Xavier McKinney. Okay, your role maybe can grow here. And then even on a lower level, I should say, not low, a guy like Micah McFadden, you go, okay, well, now that we have Bobby Okereke, you've been able to develop as well. There's, I think, I wonder if you agree, more optimism around the middle of that draft class coming into this year right now and into training camp than there would have been if you asked this question going into last year. And that's not a bad thing. It's just a reality. It's why year 3. Give me 3 years and I'll tell you, because some think, can't miss like Evan Neal's end up maybe being misses, and you have to recalibrate how you view those drafts.
So, Adam, I have a slightly different take than I think you do.
Okay.
I have more questions than answers in the middle of Joe Schoen's draft there.
Well, I'm just optimistic. I don't know, but I'm at least optimistic that they're getting the opportunities. And maybe that's, sorry, I'll let you go, but maybe I'm allowing myself to be clouded by the fact that the lack of talent on the roster might be creating opportunities rather than the players are creating opportunities.
Bingo. It's like, what is the competition for these players to get on the field
right.
when
who's
the
in Cor'Dale
21 draft class isn't even here anymore, right? Like,
right.
So that's a little bit of my challenge, because when you mention those players, and I like your positivity on a Monday. I'm really excited about it. Actually, I don't want to
a week here.
I don't want to downplay it because it's exciting. It's a Monday. We got a long week ahead of us, but Adam, you mentioned Joshua Zudo. It seems like he was mismanaged from the start. I don't know how much was on him versus the coaching staff, putting him in positions to fail. Now being a swing tackle, and they say, this is what you're going to do. Let's see what you've got. I'm interested in it, but I don't have the confidence yet because I haven't seen it.
Mm-hmm.
When you move over to someone like Cor'Dale Flott, you mentioned they played him in the slot. They're trying to put him outside. Is it because there's no one outside that can challenge him, and he's like, I guess he's the best one there? Sure. Or do they think he's actually going to flourish on the outside? Daniel Bellinger, they made a trade for Darren Waller. They went and drafted Theo Johnson. They are trying to re-engineer this tight end room. Did they trade for Darren Waller because he was a wide receiver number 1 type, or did they trade for him because they didn't think Daniel Bellinger could take the next step into it? I don't know. You mentioned Dane Belton, obviously was a key rotational piece. Micah McFadden played a lot better, so I'm excited about that. Sure. And then you go to the end of DJ Davidson, Marcus McCathan, and Darren Beavers, not really getting on the field too much. But that middle where you need those players to be complementary role pieces, it's year 3, and I still have more questions than I have answers as of right now.
So would you agree? Because I think I back myself down there just in terms of optimism and where it stands. But 11 players in. So here's what I would say. We obviously, listen, circle, double underline, highlight Evan Neal, and the Giants' seeming commitment here going to training camp to say, we're going to try to fix this guy. It's kind of critical to be able to look back at this draft class and saying, overall, it was a success. But if I looked at this draft class and I tell you right now, well, Thibodeau's obviously a success. I'll tell you that I believe that Robinson, we can say it needs to continue to grow, but I think that is a success. I think I'm pretty confident year 3 is going to solidify what they believed in him when they got him. Then after that, you go down a pretty big cut to go into the 5th round in 146. But I think Micah McFadden has been a success by a mid to late round pick that clearly is a contributor on this roster. So we got three locked in, I would say. Then after Evan Neal, he's in his own entire category. I think you're right in saying Belton, Flott, and Bellinger. Those 3 players. Now, Daniel Bellinger does not need to be a stud starting tight end. Remember, he's a 4th round pick, 112 overall, but he does need to show some consistency going back to his rookie year. A guy like Dane Belton, again, 4th rounder right there. He probably needs to show you that, and he's already been rotation, but maybe consistency inside of that role. And the Cor'Dale Flott one, I will say, 81, he might be, again, after Evan Neal, the low-key kind of make or break of this draft class is if your 3rd round pick ends up being a contributor for this roster consistently and playing well, then you've converted, right? Because if you talk about having 11 draft picks in a draft class and you can look back and say, hey, 6 of them were successes, that's a win. Like, that is a win by any NFL hit percentage. Obviously, the other pick there at 7 becomes very looming, but that's what you have to watch for here is those 3 players, I think, in this 3rd year.
Yeah, I think you did a really good breakdown of that, Adam. I think when you look at the 5th and 6th round guys, you look at, well, you mentioned Micah McFadden was a hit. That feels like a success. I think, you look at DJ Davidson, Marcus McCathan, and Darian Beavers, and you kind of sit there and say, well, you were kind of you were buying lotto tickets to try to see if one of them would be a key contributor.
Yeah,
You
and
really
if one of them does,
if
one of them does, that'd be a real steal here. Any one of those 3 comes out as being anything at their position, and you feel like that's a success,
right? And like the idea behind drafting Dane Belton and having him in the system is for things like when Xavier McKinney is getting $18 million on the open market. You have a guy that knows the system, that is familiar with the organization, that you know what you're getting from, and he needs to be able to step in and play. The Giants going up and getting Tyler Nubin in the 2nd round almost feels like they're saying, well, we don't know if we can just hand the keys over to this safety room as constructed. We still need talent there. And so the Giants are still trying to replace that Xavier McKinney talent, which you hoped would have been Dane Belton to be able to step in. And so, Adam, I think you're spot on with the Flott, Bellinger, and Belton. Those 3 are really going to make the decision on this draft class on whether it was a hit or miss. They can cover up the stink of what has happened with Evan Neal if they become serviceable starters for this team. And I will say this is why year 3 is so important. Every single person gave the Giants an A or an A+ on Evan Neal, the player. Everyone had this wrong. And the question is, was it coaching? Was it talent? Was it translation to the NFL? We're going to have our answers by the end of year 3 because obviously the Giants have changed offensive line coaches. Carmen Brasillo is now there for the Giants. If multiple regimes and like multiple coaches and offensive line coaches, etc., have tried to coach this guy up and it's still not there, I think at some point you turn around and you have to look inward and say, maybe everyone just whiffed on this one.
And that's why coming up here in a second, there is something about this being a critical year. We've heard some of this. Well, would Brian Daboll be on the hot seat? John Mara wants to be committed to not shaking things up once again. And that's all well and good. But there's a reason why it could end up needing to be shook up again, because this is how much these players are going to impact the New York Football Giants. I'll give you a little curveball here on that success story coming up in just one moment. And as we continue today's OGP, we of course let you know about one of our other sponsors, and that's going to be Personam. It's an AI-driven cyber threat detection engine. Personam improves your vision into your network security environment and allows you to see cyber threats that other tools and platforms simply cannot do. Personam is always vigilant and always learning. Now, the one other note here, Andy, as we talk about coming into this critical season and expectations for the New York Football Giants, it's worth noting that when you go back to this draft class, 11 players deep, 31 games for Kayvon Thibodeau, that's really strong. Whether or not it's a shaky kind of sample size, 29 games for Daniel Bellinger, who also dealt obviously with that eye injury as well. Cor'Dale Flott has appeared in 25 games. Micah McFadden, 33 games. He's appeared in the most games out of anybody coming out of that draft class. But notably, Evan Neal, just 20. Remember, Wan'Dale Robinson started his career with injuries, 21. Joshua Zudu, who may be entering a key offensive line season for himself, just 16 games. And that's talking about a guy taken in the 3rd round. So, sample size is relative, and then experience matters. When you sit here and think about a guy like Joshua Ezeudu or Cor'Dale Flott, 16 and 25 games respectively, and then up the board even to Wan'Dale, you go, oh, well, you're talking about a half a season or a season more, right? Micah McFadden has played in twice as many games as Joshua Ezeudu so far in his career. On the one hand, that's a great sign for Micah McFadden. On the other hand, it's damning about taking a player at 67 overall and not having him be a contributor by this point of his career.
Yeah, that is the challenge. Anytime you think about these high first, second, third round picks are the ones that are supposed to be contributors or can step in relatively quickly and contribute.
Yeah.
Adam, the one thing I keep going back to, which just blows my mind, is like when you think about Evan Neal and it feels like his struggles have been going on for a long time as a Giant. Do you know how old Evan Neal is?
23.
He's 23 years old still. Like he's still so young that like you have to hope that someone can carve and mold this gargantuan human into a serviceable right tackle. Like you have to feel like that's still on the board of possibilities.
And that actually was going to be like my curveball of all of this is, and believe me, if you follow the show, if you watch the show, we've plenty of times come in and said, you got to do something different. Now, we have pushback over this course this offseason of kick Evan Neal into guard. He'll just be successful there when he hasn't had success on the outside. We don't believe in that. It should be a sink or swim scenario for him this year. But to your point, if we believe that the regime under Dave Gettleman was poorly run, if we believe the coaching staff was not ideal, and if we believe the offensive line coaches specifically were not the right people to have in there. Remember, go back to Andrew Thomas. When he first came in the league, they said, let's switch up the way you work. And they did that for a first season. And then they said, that seems really weird. We really liked you coming out of college. Go back to what was working for you. And now he's considered one of the best left tackles in the game. There has to be a world here where, as a Giants fan, in your heart of hearts, as nervous as it may be, you have to put a certain amount of stock in the idea that pedigree, and to your point, Andy, age is on the side of Evan Neal right now, and the ability to find some level of value, and not even as a 7th overall pick, but just value as a starting right tackle still in the NFL.
Yeah, forget about Pro Bowl level anymore. Can you stay healthy on the field, contributing at like just above replacement level play? And I think the Giants would take that immediately, just knowing how much of a struggle it's been for Evan Neal. My last question for you, Adam, is this.
Talk to me, Goose.
Of the 11 players, so we looked at the previous draft class of 2021. There were 6 players. We don't expect any of those 6 players to be on the roster at the end of their first round of contracts, right? Maybe Azeez Ojulari if he comes in, but clearly they traded for Brian Burns for a reason. He's now just a rotational piece. There are 11 in the 2022 Joe Schoen draft class.
That's right.
Right now, going into year 3, which is the critical year, how many of those players do you think have the chance to get a second contract from the Giants?
Okay. I just said be optimistic about Evan Neal, but I can't put him into that category. I can't put him in the category right now. Second contracts for Kayvon Thibodeau, second contract for Wan'Dale Robinson, second contract for Micah McFadden. And then I think you have to pause there. And then, as we said before, Belton, Flott, Bellinger, those guys fall into the category of, depending on this season, you could certainly get there. But the reality would be I could only say 3 guys right now would I say are deserving of getting that second contract. And it wouldn't be hard for me to squint and see a couple more getting them.
Yeah, I think 3 is probably the right number when you think about Thibodeau and Wan'Dale. If Wan'Dale has another year where he can stay healthy and be productive in the system, it feels like a guy that you would want to keep around. I mean, we're obviously doing this in a vacuum where price isn't necessarily like factored into the whole equation. Like, yeah, if a guy prices himself out, sure. But, Daniel Bellinger after year 3, if the Giants like what they see from him and they like the tandem of him and Theo Johnson, what if you redid your deal with Daniel Bellinger and got him for $5 million a year as a rotational one, as opposed to waiting for his contract to go out and seeing the $7, $8, $10 million that higher end tight ends are starting to get? But I think, to your point, you hope that the Giants can have 3 of those guys, maybe 4, maybe some come back like Darnay Holmes did and just sign a 1-year deal afterwards. But yeah, I mean, it's tough, Adam. If you can't think about at least a third of your players that you're drafting being on the roster for the second contract, it feels like you're just turning over the roster so much and you're making so many mistakes that you either have to use more draft capital or trade capital in order to make, or free agency capital to actually correct any of those mistakes.
And it's funny, maybe ultimately, saying like, because you mentioned a guy like Darnay Holmes, and we can jump back there. We looked at that 2021 draft class and said like, yeesh, no one's going to come back. Now, to your point, Andrew Thomas, cornerstone piece. Xavier McKinney leaves in free agency. Listen, to whatever level you want to say it, Matt Pert is still on this roster. Darnay Holmes is still on this roster. Carter Coughlin is still on this roster. Now, that's it. That's all that you get out of this one. Cam Brown just left this offseason. No more Shane Lemieux. On down the line you go. So you do have 4 guys there. But I think even probably more crystallizing would be multi-year contracts, right? Because Darnay Holmes was brought back, but it's not like he was brought back and there's this level of expectation. It was basically in a new regime. You showed some special teams value as well. And so it's worth it for both of us. You want another shot to continue to prove yourself. We need to make sure we have some depth. Okay, let's keep you around. And that's when you get back to this class for the Giants and you say, who's going to be deserving of that multi-year contract? Daniel Bellinger being brought back? Yeah, it's entirely possible, right? But when you think about multiple year contracts, I wonder if like Cor'Dale Flott, this is a big year for him because either you're convincing us that you are a key contributor here, and I actually think that he has a chance for that, whether or not it's ultimately as the outside starter or not, but you're worthy of multi-year contracts versus your Darnay Holmes model. Let's give you a 1-year deal, see what happens, and we'll go from there. So it's interesting, man. And a lot of these guys are in critical crossroads for their careers, and then it directly impacts what happens for the Giants.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, Adam, I think you mentioned Cor'Dale Flott. I look at Dane Belton. I think that's another player where you kind of look at it and say, Xavier McKinney left, and you thought there was going to be an opening, but the Giants decided to sign Jalen Mills, which will play like a kind of a rotational secondary piece. They used the 2nd-round draft pick on Tyler Nubin. The Giants made some moves in the secondary to be able to shore that up. So this is a big year for Dane Belton to figure out whether or not he can build on the success he had last year. We obviously were extremely high on him and Daniel Bellinger initially coming out. And so can they continue to add more to their game? Can they get on the field more often? We're going to have to see that, especially with a guy like Dane Belton and Daniel Bellinger. Those are the 2 that I really am going to be keeping an eye on as we get towards training camp.
100%. And notably, not for today, but another year from now, when we talk about the 2023 draft class, remember, mention the games played, every single player for them, Banks 15, John Michael Schmitz, critical 13, 17. Jalen Hyatt played in all 17 games. He didn't play a lot, but he played in all 17 games. 13 for Eric Gray. Think about a critical year for him and all the turnover in that room. 17 games for Trey Hawkins. Certainly, special teams are a factor when we talk about some of these guys. But it's interesting to see how many reps these guys are getting year over year. And if you think about that list, you don't have to squint too hard and say, oh, we're going to be having a very similar conversation with about half of that draft class as well. And it's a much shorter one. That's why this year, that class of 2022 and 11 players, you're either making 15%, 20% of your roster up, or you're talking about needing to replenish it. That being the case, my friends, we have more positional reviews specifically coming up when we take a look at this roster. We had done the secondary, but what about the cornerback rooms we handled? The safety room becomes interesting. The linebacker core becomes interesting. And of course, offensively, how are we going to flesh out that tight end room in the end? All things that you can see right here on One Giant Podcast over on YouTube, also on your podcast feeds, where we ask, not only supporting our sponsors if you can, but go over and subscribe on your podcast feeds. It moves the needle in a big way for the show, and we greatly, greatly appreciate it. Over 2,700 subscribers on YouTube, looking to get to 3,000 before the season starts. Do all those great things for us because we appreciate it, and we're going to keep coming back here for you. But until the next time, until the best times, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand that people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.